So is this something you're going to use for a class, or
Um,
are you actually put it on YouTube?
if you will give me permission, yes, I will. And usually I translate them to Russian,
Oh, okay.
so people who are interested in consciousness study
No, sure.
can.
Feel free to put it up wherever you want.
Great.
Sure.
So let's begin with who are you and what's your area of research?
So my name is Scott Jordan. I'm an experimental psychologist. In the laboratory, I study anticipation, and I study how our unconscious anticipations develop, and then I study how they show up in our perceptions.
Mm-hmm. And what do you mean by anticipation?
So empirically, what I will do is have people use buttons on a computer to make a stimulus move back and forth across the screen. At some point while they're controlling it, the stimulus will unexpectedly vanish, and I'll ask them to use a crosshair to indicate where they saw it vanish. And what you find is that people who have not controlled the dot before, when they're simply watching it, they say it vanishes a little bit ahead. But if I've actually controlled the dot before and I'm simply watching it move, I say it vanishes much further ahead. Mm-hmm. So what this does is show us that these anticipations that are influencing our perception of the dot are not a mistake. They're not error. They're not, we can call it bias, but I think that's kind of a dysfunctional way to talk about it. Part of what it means to be an expert is to be able to control the events at increasingly large timescales. And I argue that those unconscious dynamics that afford us getting further ahead provide the background within which stimulus events in the environment can be foregrounded as stimuli. So the point being, stimuli from the environment always encounter a world of lived anticipation that's contextualizing our experiences all the time. And we don't really even know it until we're surprised.
I met Julia Mosbridge several times, and she has also research in anticipation. Is it connected with yours somehow?
Yeah. I'm not sure I know of the connections, but sorry. Yeah. So, go ahead. So empirically, that's what I do. Some of the other stuff I do empirically is look at how groups, when groups interact, they create events in the environment that allow them to work together at larger time scales so that they can anticipate what the other person's going to do. A real life example would be two football players. One has the ball and the other makes a run. If they're used to playing with each other, the running movements of the forward aren't simply running movements, but they're also cues as to where and when they're going to be, which then allows the person with the ball to actually kick the ball to a certain location. They arrive. But those anticipatory dynamics are practiced over a long period of time and allow groups to bridge larger and larger time scales. So that's the sort of stuff I do empirically. And then what I've been doing more theoretically and philosophically for some time is trying to follow the lead of people like Rosen, Stuart Kaufman, Maturana Varela, and try to argue that this anticipation is not just something we do, it's actually something that we are. So we are anticipatory systems, and I go through what kind of narrative do we have to tell about what we are and what the world is in order for anticipation to be what we are. And that's why I tell that whole self-organizing energy transformation hierarchy is a matter of what we're in. So instead of this being a physical world, I argue it's a self-organizing energy transformation hierarchy. It's completely compatible with science. And then when I talk about what I am within the space of that energy transformation hierarchy, I talk about myself as a self-sustaining energy transformation system, again, completely consistent with science. And then I ask, what do concepts like anticipation mean within that conceptual space. And what I come up with is, when you have a self-sustaining system such as a single cell, and the microdynamics of the inside of the cell, if you like, actually produce and give rise to the cell membrane itself, that larger temporal scale cell membrane is actually constraining the dynamic possibilities of the smaller scale states that produce it. So you have this, what I would call a micro-macro synergy, whatever you want to call it. But I try to argue that that larger scale dynamic actually pre-specifies, constrains, anticipates the potential dynamic possibilities of the systems that constitute it. The degree of temporality is, of course, relative to the time scale of the persistence of the cell wall and the dynamics that constitute it. So the idea is, if we start there talking about anticipation, then I think we can scale that up over the course of evolution, and we can start to see the things we call as anticipations as actually these sorts of larger scale constraints on what should happen. So we say brains anticipate, but I would argue so do neural networks, so do single cell organisms, in the sense that what they do is pre-specify or constrain the transformation possibilities of the nested systems that produced them. So that's what I try to do. And then if that gets me anticipation at multiple scales.
And this is what is your presentation about.
Yeah, right.
Let's go at least for some.
You want to go through some slides?
Let's just through some slides, yeah.
Well, I'll tell you what we'll do then.
Especially when you put the context or...
Yeah, that's where, so if anticipation is something we are, how do we do that? And instead of referring to what we're in as a physical world, I refer to it as a self-organizing energy transformation hierarchy. I'm going to assume people know what that means. Herbivores consume carnivores.
I see here is a kind of problem. So if we say that nature is matter...
Say that again.
If materialistic point of view is saying that nature is matter, or matter is a reality, we at least has a kind of reality.
Yeah.
But what is the reality in your sense?
So when we look at the reality of something like matter, you know, it seems to me like what we're really doing is talking about stability. So whatever it is that we call matter is some sort of stable state in a molecule, an atom, or etc. And we just sort of assume that that stability comes for free. But I think it's completely consistent with science to say that that stability is actually a persistent state of tension between strong forces of atomic attraction, and then weak forces of gravity. So the matter doesn't exist as it exists all by itself. Its properties are not intrinsic to itself. It's actually the stabilities that we call matter are actually just as contextually dependent as anything else we find in reality. So,
right, but contextually dependent means there is someone who creates a context.
No. No.
Like an
It
observer.
depends on what we think we're doing with words, right? So quite often what we think we're doing with words is sort of stepping outside of reality and pointing to what reality is. This is this, this is this, this is this. When for me, what we're doing with words is actually abstracting quite a bit about what we're in and cannot get outside of. So we cannot get outside of reality and point at it. What we can do is generate abstractions about what we are in and use those in ways that help us transform, what we're in. So if calling a stability matter helps us change what we're in effectively, which it does in terms of the periodic table and that sort of thing, then that's its utility, that's how it gains its value. But when I use the word context, I'm not trying to point to something and say that that's context. When I use the word context, what I'm asking is there anything that exists as it does, completely independent of all context? And I would argue the answer is no, right?
What do you mean by context?
Well,
Can you give
that's
me
the
an
problem.
example?
That's the thing is when we start talking about reality and we're using words,
right.
we're going to pick some concept to start with. So you can pick the concept matter, right? And you can call it physical, and then you can start your nomenclature there and build up.
And this is a context. An example.
Someone could say, well, I mean, even if you look at quantum physics and my understanding of quantum physics, there are still people who believe that there are things called contexts, and there are things that are not context. And this context, non-context duality, I think, is unnecessary, right? There's nothing that exists independent of context. So whatever context is, we're going to continue to do science and to generate descriptions of it. It might end up being something described by quantum physics. It may end up being something described by string theory. But for me, when I'm going to talk about reality, I'm going to use the concept. I'm going to start with the concept of context because it doesn't. It allows more degrees of freedom in terms of how I work with my science, my words, my philosophy. Whereas the concept physical constrains in ways that are logically unnecessary, right? I don't have to call something physical. I don't have to call a tree a physical thing. I can call a tree a multi-scale, self-sustaining energy transformation system, and I don't need to call it physical, chemical, or mental, right? Those are words that were created to talk about particular levels of order, but it's not logically necessary that we do so. I don't know if that's answering your question.
So I'm still trying to understand if I'm saying the tree is a physical thing, or if I'm saying the tree is energy, like you said, it's a different context.
Well, I would argue that calling the tree an embodied context, what it does is on purpose. It draws our attention to the idea that the property treeness is a contextually dependent phenomenon. So you can't have trees without a whole system of context being in place. Whereas calling it a tree and calling it a physical thing completely allows us to ignore all the contextual phenomena that are necessarily required to be in place for a phenomenon like treeness to exist, right?
Right, but isn't even the idea of phenomena is context?
I don't disagree. I mean, for me, the question is what's going to be your final ontological concept? So 200 years ago it was God, right? And now it's probably causality, right? The way a lot of people talk, the final ontological concept.
Causality is just, it's not an ontology.
I don't disagree. What I'm saying is, for me, I'm starting with the concept of context because I don't think there's anything that exists as it does independently of context. So instead of using the word context in a way where we have a thing and then we put it in context, I would rather argue that that thing itself is an emergent byproduct of context, right? So it's never disconnected from reality. It's never what it is independent of anything else, right?
Okay, but by context you understand the informational quality of something, of phenomena. Is it information?
Well, again, what I'm doing in this ontology is trying to get away from concepts, physical, mental, and information. And the reason I'm trying to move away from the concept of information is because when people use it, what they get is meaning for free, right? What they get is aboutness without explaining why that aboutness is necessarily there. So what I try to do is take the principle of aboutness and describe it without resorting to the concept physical, mental, or information. So when I tell you that the tree is an energy transformation system.
Right, but you use energy.
Yeah. Yep.
And usually, as I understand, like the world could be described of three principles, like matter, energy, and information. So you just trying to use just one, energy.
I think I'm taking the risk of starting there to see how far I can go with it. I'm not going to deny that.
So you're trying to start with energy.
Yeah.
So only energy exists.
Well, I mean, it depends on what you call the Big Bang, you know, and all matter is a state of energy, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so.
So you reduce everything to energy.
I don't know if I want to. I guess so, but I also want. What I want to do is, and this is going to sound like it's from left field, but I want a thoroughly relational ontology, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what I want is an ontology that works under the guiding principle that everything's about everything and nothing is about itself.
Mm-hmm.
All phenomena that we point out and call phenomena exist as those phenomena, chairs, windows, tables, because it emerges from a multi-scale context. Hi, can I help you? We're just chatting for a moment. I'll make sure I turn it off. Are we not supposed to?
It's okay. This is TV. We finish.
Yeah. I can turn it off with this.
Yeah. Okay.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
No problem.
But
no, go ahead.
I'm trying to ask. So, but isn't it me as observer to see that the window is phenomena? So, kind of, it's already context with exist inside me
Yeah.
to see on a window as phenomena.
Or we could say that the phenomena of windowness,
Right,
the
but
phenomenon of windowness entails you.
but there is no phenomena of windowness, isn't it?
I would argue that
I'm who creating the context of that.
So I'm sympathetic to that view, but I would
Yeah.
argue that what happens is the phenomenon we call windowness entails you. Right?
But
You
who
are
we,
part
we
of that phenomenon.
okay, we at least you are putting we like in hierarchy higher than me. So there is we who created phenomena of windowness, and it's applied to me. I'm like contextual level.
I think there's I think if I have to put these parts in motion, there's enough overlap in the phenomenon that we call you and the phenomenon that we call me. There's enough overlap in the patterns of those phenomena that windowness is a phenomenon we believe we share. Right?
So still we,
Yeah.
it's your first phenomena who is define everything.
No, I believe that spiders have phenomena, you know. I
Still.
believe that electrons have phenomena.
So means I.
I don't mind the I, but this is not an individualistic I. This is a holist I, right?
Why?
This is a stability that emerges within context. So matter, a particle doesn't exist because of its particleness, right? Particleness is an emergent byproduct of contemporary philosophy of science talks about mass being a property of something moving through a Higgs field. What is the Higgs field? Something that permeates all of reality. So the most basic principle, the most basic property is something that we're now arguing is grounded in everything else. This is a way of thinking that was very prominent in the German idealism of the 1800s. And we worked very hard in the 20th century to get rid of that way of thinking. But it is, I guess if you like, I-ness, but it's not alone I-ness. It's not.
Why not?
Because it's logically, the way I'm talking, it's logically impossible for something to exist as it exists all by itself, independent of any context.
I'm not saying independent.
Right.
I'm saying that I create the phenomena. Even if you say about window, you kind of separate it. Even when you name the window, you put the borders. So this is a part of the context.
Yeah.
And it exists because of the context which you put on that.
I don't disagree. I would say it just slightly differently. Windowness entails you. But I don't think you're creating windowness, because windowness is also creating part of it.
This is a classical way of science, like materialistic, that window exists independently on me.
Yeah.
So it has windowness, and this windowness
see, that's where I
influence
don't.
on
That's
me.
I would believe it'd be logically incoherent for me to claim that there's nothing out there, and it'd be logically incoherent for me to say that what exists out there doesn't exist independently of me. So there is.
So there is no window.
No, wait. There are phenomena that
No
exist
phenomena.
independent of me. The whole universe. It's not right to say the universe exists independently of me. What I would say is the property that we would call a window entails me.
Window. If it's nothing exists independently, no window exists at all.
But there are so many different levels of scale entailed in that phenomenon. There's a scale we call the atomic. There's a scale we call the molecular.
Nothing really exists.
I don't know what that means.
Only you.
What?
Only you.
No, I can't. I would be logically contradicting myself if I claimed that I create reality. Right? It's just too much evidence to the contrary.
Why? What's evidence?
What's the evidence?
Mm-hmm.
What the evidence is the number of things that persist outside of my sense of influence. Right?
For example.
So I have the strong belief and sense that when I open that door, there's going to be a hallway and I can go up some stairs.
Right.
And I don't have the sense that I'm creating that hallway. I don't have the sense that I'm creating those stairs. Now, it could be the case that I am, but it's completely inconsistent with the science that I've been a part of to not begin with some kind of model of there being something outside of myself, right? It could be the case that I'm not, and that's probably why Kant quit and called it phenomena, right? It's okay, if it's there, fine, it's unknowable and whatever.
Why unknowable? If you are creating that so you can make it knowable.
So look, it could be the case, it's like the refrigerator light, right? It could be the case that the refrigerator light is always on, and I'll never know until I open the door. In the worldview that I've been developing consistently with my science, my theory, my philosophy, I posit the existence of myself being a self-sustaining system that's contextually emergent from a larger scale energy transformation hierarchy. Right. I mean, I don't know. That's where my ontology begins. I can't tell you that it's right, but that's never been the point of ontology for me anyway. Right. So correspondence. Right.
From where to where energy transforms?
I'm not sure what you're asking.
Yes, if you're writing that you are or something is energy transformation hierarchy.
Yeah.
So the energy transformed from one point to another point.
Well, that I would argue is what is studied by physics. That's what's studied by chemistry. That's what's studied by biology. In the end, it's also what's studied by psychology, and it's also what's studied by sociology, right? We look at, for example, in psychology, we'll look at an individual person, we put them in front of a lab, we have them press buttons, And we don't at all talk about the energy it takes to keep all that going. And we act as if that energy doesn't matter. What I have is a physical, biological system that processes information. And I would argue that's one way to talk about it ontologically, but another way to talk about it, which I think is more nuanced, more consistent with, dare I say, lived life, is that what this is a multi-scale, self-sustaining embodiment of all of this. And what I do when I'm here is I modulate what I'm in while it modulates me.
Where is the hierarchy? Do you have your slides with
So the hierarchy would be something like, well, here you have at the top there you have an artistic rendering where you have raw energy from the sun being consumed by plants, and then you have plants being consumed by humans, etc. And then, of course, you see the emergence of ideas on the far right. What you have here is a 1988 schemata from a paper by Odom in Science. And what you have here is what was called low-quality energy. That would just be raw sunlight that finds itself captured by an energy transformer such as a plant. And we even know the chemical substrates that, in a sense, capture the light energy, and that light energy is transformed. Some of it's dissipated, and a lot of it's used to sustain plantness, right? And then herbivores come along, and what they do is they capture the energy encapsulated in plant form, and then what carnivores do is capture the energy encapsulated in biological form, or herbivore form, or animal form, whatever you want to call it.
And where is human being transformed?
So, well,
what's the next stage of energy transformation post a human being?
Well, so one thing I like to do is try to point out that different scientists have talked about different levels of self-sustaining work at different points in science. They've not, I think Mark Bickert is the first one I know of who brought them all together. And then what I try to do is wrap them up in a theory I call wild systems theory, which what I do is try to see how much mileage I can get with this idea of multi-scale self-sustaining work as a way to resolve philosophical problems that face us when we begin with physical, mental, objective, subjective distinctions. And so that's my motivation in the work, right? So energy is being transformed, stabilities are being generated and sustained at every level across this multi-scale self-sustaining system.
And what's the next stage of transformation?
For us?
For us.
Well, you know.
For you and for us.
Well, I mean, one thing I like to point out is that self-sustaining systems as embodiments of context have been so successful because they just change the context, right? So ants generate pheromone gradients. Those gradients become their world. They could become part of their actual world, and they afford sustainment. Birds generate chirp gradients, and those chirps become part of the world, and it affords coordination among birds that would not be possible without those chirps.
And this is you call context.
Yeah,
the world they generate.
Yeah, exactly. They're altering the context within which they sustain themselves.
So the same idea as you generate the concept, the world beyond this door.
Well, I would feel more comfortable saying ants generate pheromone contexts, birds generate auditory contexts, and I would argue humans create, I don't know, I've tried to call them intentional contexts. I don't really have a great name for it, but it's this idea that part of how we've gotten increasingly further ahead and become increasingly abstract to the point where we live in this weird space where I can text my friends and say, let's all get together tomorrow night at the movie theater.
So you generated this
I do
world.
this,